There is a question that keeps coming up in Filipino households and family group chats that never stop. And the question is not about rankings. It is not about trophies. It is not even about the next match. The question is this: why does watching Alex Eala feel like something more than watching tennis? Because it does. Every Filipino who has stayed awake past midnight to watch her serve out a match knows that the emotion they are feeling goes beyond sport. Every parent who has turned to their child during a tiebreak and said, "Watch this, watch her, this is a Filipino doing this," they know that something else is happening. Something that cannot be measured by the scoreboard. Something that a WTA ranking number cannot fully explain. Alex Eala is 21 years old. She has one WTA title. She has never won a Grand Slam. By the cold, hard logic of professional tennis statistics, she is a very promising young player on an exceptional upward trajectory. That is the version of this story the numbers tell. But that is not the story of the Philippines. And understanding the gap between those two versions of Alex Eala, the statistical one and the cultural one, is the only way to understand why Filipinos are calling her something much bigger than a tennis player. Let's start at the beginning, because before you can understand what Eala has become, you have to understand what tennis was in the Philippines before she arrived. Tennis was never the sport that defined Filipino identity. In a country where basketball is practically a religion, where courts exist in the most remote barangays, where the Philippine Basketball Association has been running continuously since 1975, where children grow up with a ball in their hands before they can properly read, tennis existed on the periphery. It was played, yes. There were Filipino players at the regional level, there were club memberships, there were school programs. But tennis was never the thing that made the Philippines stop. The Philippines stopped for Manny Pacquiao. The Philippines stopped for PBA championships. The Philippines came close to stopping for Carlos Yulo at the gymnastics mat in Paris, for Hidilyn Diaz lifting that barbell at the Tokyo Olympics, for EJ Obiena soaring over a pole vault bar at European meets. But tennis? Tennis was a sport Filipinos respected from a distance. A sport dominated by nations with entirely different climates, different funding structures, different sporting histories. Switzerland, Spain, Serbia, the United States. The countries that produced the legends of the game felt impossibly far from the islands of the Philippines. And then came Alex Eala, and the distance collapsed. She did not collapse it overnight. This is not a story about a single moment of inspiration. This is a story about accumulation, about what happens when a young Filipino girl enters one of the most elite tennis academies in the world, the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, Spain, and starts winning things that nobody from her country had ever won before. Junior titles, international recognition, a level of technical development that suggested she was not just a regional talent, but a genuine global prospect. The Filipino sports media watched with cautious optimism. The casual Filipino fan watched with curiosity. And then the wins started coming at the professional level, and something shifted. It shifted because of how her victories felt. Not just what they meant on the ranking sheet, but how they landed in the chest of everyone watching. When she beat a top 10 player for the first time, it did not feel like an upset. It felt like a statement. When she made a run that put her on the same court as the biggest names in women's tennis, it did not feel like a lucky draw. It felt like proof. Proof of something that the Philippines had been quietly waiting to see, demonstrated for a very long time. That Filipinos belong in those spaces too. That is the sentence at the heart of everything. That Filipinos belong in those spaces too. And you cannot fully explain to someone who has not grown up as part of a nation that has so often watched the global stage from the outside just how powerful it is to see one of your own walking onto that stage and refusing to be moved off it. The Miami Open in 2025 was one of the first moments where the wider world started to pay attention. She went through 3 Grand Slam champions in succession. 3. And each victory was not just a result, it was a demonstration. A demonstration that the coaching, the dedication, the years of sacrifice and training, and early mornings and grueling sessions that Eala had poured into her game had produced something real. Something that the best players in the world had to reckon with. The Philippines woke up to those results and felt something they had not quite felt before in relation to tennis. They felt ownership. This was their story now too. And then came Wimbledon 2026. And everything got bigger. She reached the fourth round at the All England Club, the fourth round of Wimbledon, on grass. In a tournament that for over a century had been dominated almost exclusively by players from Europe, the United States, and Australia, she became the first Filipino to reach the second week of a Grand Slam singles tournament. And along the way, she knocked out the defending Wimbledon champion, Iga Swiatek, in straight sets. Swiatek, who at that point was a four-time Grand Slam champion and one of the most formidable players of her generation, gone, in straight sets, by a 21-year-old from Quezon City. The watch parties in the Philippines for that match were not small gatherings. They were community events, barangay halls, mall food courts, living rooms packed wall to wall with people who had never attended a tennis tournament in their lives, but who were suddenly absolutely riveted by every point. And when Eala won that match, when the scoreline confirmed what had happened, the reaction was not the polite appreciation of tennis fans processing an interesting result. It was the sound of a nation that had been holding its breath, releasing it all at once. That is not a tennis reaction. That is a cultural moment. And then Washington, D.C., and then the title, and then everything changed in a way that even the most optimistic Filipino fan had not fully prepared for. The Mubadala DC Open final. Alex Eala versus Jessica Pegula. Pegula, who is American, who plays to home support on the American hardcourt circuit, who is a consistent top 5 player and one of the most respected names in women's tennis. The match was close. The tennis was extraordinary, and when Eala lifted that trophy, when she became the first Filipina to win a WTA Tour singles title, when she held that hardware above her head and the Philippine flag appeared on screens across the world, the country did not sleep that night. The comparisons to Manny Pacquiao started immediately, and they started for a reason that goes beyond hype, because what Pacquiao did for the Philippines during his peak years was not merely win boxing matches. What Pacquiao did was give an entire nation a shared focal point, a shared reason to feel proud. At the height of his career, when he walked into a ring in Las Vegas on a Saturday night, the streets of Manila emptied, the crime statistics dropped, the noise from every television set in every household across the archipelago merged into one collective roar. He made the Philippines feel like it was there, like it was represented, like it could compete with anyone in the world. Eala herself has spoken about this. She grew up watching Pacquiao's fights at home. She remembers the electricity around those events. And when the comparisons started coming, when journalists and fans began placing her name in the same sentence as the Pambansang Kamao, the national fist, she was thoughtful and humble in her response. She said she is still very, very far from his level. She said they are two unique journeys and that neither one takes away from the other. She said the feeling Pacquiao gave to Filipinos, that feeling of having someone to rally over, someone to come together around, is something she is beginning to understand from the inside now. That last part matters, because she is not comparing herself to Pacquiao. She is describing the function she is starting to serve, and that function is bigger than tennis. What does it mean for a sport to go from invisible to unmissable in a country of over 100 million people? It means that children who had never picked up a tennis racket are suddenly asking where they can learn. It means that courts that were underbooked are suddenly waitlisted. It means that parents who would never have considered tennis as a path for their children are now watching Eala's matches and doing the arithmetic in their heads, wondering, daring to wonder, whether their child could do something like that someday. The visibility argument in sports is one of the most powerful and least appreciated forces in athletic culture. When there is no one who looks like you, who comes from where you come from, competing at the highest level of a sport, that sport feels closed. It feels like someone else's game, not yours. And that feeling, that quiet assumption that certain spaces simply are not for your people, can last for generations. It can shape the entire sporting culture of a nation without anyone ever explicitly deciding that is what should happen. Alex Eala is breaking that assumption in real time. Every match she plays at a Grand Slam, every ranking point she accumulates, every time her face appears on a broadcast that millions of Filipinos are watching, she is erasing that assumption. She is replacing it with evidence. Evidence that the sport is not closed. Evidence that a girl from the Philippines can walk onto the most prestigious courts in the world and belong there. That is not something you can put a number on, but it is the most important thing happening in Philippine sports right now. And then there is the way she carries herself off the court, which amplifies everything. because Alex Eala has been deliberate and thoughtful about connecting her identity to her journey in a way that goes far beyond putting a flag sticker on her racket bag. She wears a sampaguita hair tie. The sampaguita is the national flower of the Philippines, a small, delicate white flower that carries enormous symbolic weight in Filipino culture. It appears at religious ceremonies, at weddings, at moments of beauty and remembrance. When Nike surprised her with a custom hair tie featuring the sampaguita before her Wimbledon debut, and when she shared the image online with the words, "This is a reminder of where I come from and everything that brought me here," Filipino fans did not just like the post. They felt it, because that flower is not just a design choice, it is an identity statement. It is Eala saying, very deliberately, "I am not just a tennis player who happens to be Filipino. I am Filipino, and that is inseparable from who I am as a tennis player." She showed up at the Laureus World Sports Awards in Madrid wearing a Filipiniana-inspired outfit. The Oscars of Sports, as the event is sometimes called, the biggest names in global athletics gathered in one room, and the representative from Philippine tennis walked in wearing the aesthetic of her culture, her heritage, her people. Sports analysts noted immediately that her visibility on that global platform would open opportunities not just for her, but for the entire ecosystem of Filipino athletes trying to establish themselves internationally. And when asked to describe the essence of Filipino culture, she did not give a rehearsed answer. She said, community, family, hospitality, love, kindness. She said it is layered, it is ever-evolving, it cannot be reduced to a few words. And in saying that, in refusing to flatten her identity into a slogan, she demonstrated exactly the kind of thoughtful, grounded self-awareness that makes people connect to an athlete on a deeper level than pure athletic admiration. She knows what she represents, and she is not running from it. She is leaning into it with intelligence and intention. But this is where the story gets complicated, because the same love that elevates her also creates weight. The same national pride that makes her victories feel like collective celebrations makes her defeats feel heavier than they should for any individual athlete to carry. And that tension, between the freedom to compete and the responsibility to represent, is something that Eala has been honest about. She has said there are moments where the spotlight feels heavy. There are moments where the expectations that come with being a national symbol press against the simple human need to play tennis without the weight of an entire people's hopes sitting on every game point. She said there are also moments where it is fun, where it energizes her, where the noise of a Filipino crowd packing an arena transforms into fuel rather than pressure. But the balance between those two experiences is fragile. And as her profile grows, as the expectations compound with every breakthrough result, maintaining that balance becomes increasingly complex. The tennis world is brutal. Even the best players in the world lose matches they are supposed to win. Even the most prepared athletes have bad days, bad draws, moments where the body or the mind or both simply do not perform at the level the occasion demands. When those moments come for Alex Eala, and they will come, they have already come, because that is what professional tennis is. The response from millions of invested fans matters enormously. The difference between a fan base that supports an athlete through difficulty and one that turns disappointment into pressure is the difference between an athlete who grows through adversity and one who gets crushed by the weight of representing something larger than herself. The Philippines, as a sporting culture, is still learning how to love an athlete at this level. Pacquiao-era fans who remember what it was like to follow a world champion through losses and comebacks have some institutional memory for this. But an entirely new generation of Filipino tennis fans who discovered the sport through Eala, who have never been through the experience of watching their chosen athlete have a rough tournament, absorbing that disappointment, and returning to support the next match, that generation is still finding its footing. And that is not a criticism. That is simply the reality of what it looks like when a sport comes alive in a country that was not deeply invested in it before. The growing pains of a fan base discovering how to love a sport with the patience that sport requires are real and understandable. The question is whether that fan base matures alongside the athlete, whether it learns that the journey matters more than any individual result. Because here is the deeper truth about what Alex Eala is doing for Philippine tennis. Her greatest impact is not the DC Open title, as historic and beautiful as that was. Her greatest impact is not the Wimbledon fourth round, as thrilling and unprecedented as that was. Her greatest impact is happening in classrooms, and on public courts, and in the imagination of children who are watching her, and for the first time believing that a door is open that they previously assumed was permanently closed to them. There is a generation of young Filipinos who are growing up with Alex Eala as a reference point, not a historical reference point in a textbook, an active, living, competing reference point who is winning matches right now, this week, this year. They are watching her and doing the thing that only becomes possible when someone who looks like you and comes from where you come from is succeeding at the highest level. They are imagining themselves in that picture. That is the most powerful thing an athlete can do for a sporting culture. Not win a trophy, not climb a ranking, but make a generation of young people believe that the sport is theirs to play, that the stage is available to them, that their dreams in that direction are not delusions. When a Filipino child picks up a tennis racket today and says, "I want to do what Alex Eala does," that child is stepping into a narrative that did not exist 5 years ago. And the coaches who are working with those children, the parents who are finding the courts and paying the fees and driving their kids to practice, they are all participating in something that Eala's career has made possible. This is what legacy looks like before the career is finished. This is what it looks like when a living athlete is already changing the trajectory of a sport in their home country, not by winning every match, not by being perfect, but by showing up, week after week, on the biggest stages in the world and refusing to disappear. The Philippine flag goes up at these tournaments, and it means something different now than it did 5 years ago. It is not just the flag of a country that has athletes in the draw. It is the flag of a country that is developing a genuine tennis culture, a genuine pipeline of young talent, a genuine belief that this is a sport where Filipinos can not only participate, but excel. Alex Eala did not do that alone. There are coaches and federations and sponsors and infrastructure decisions that contributed to the conditions that allowed her to emerge. But she is the proof of concept. She is the demonstration that the work produces results at the highest level. And that demonstration, that visible, undeniable, broadcast-to-the-world demonstration, is the thing that changes what the next generation believes is possible. There are Filipino journalists who have spent years covering Philippine sports, who are now describing what is happening around Eala as something they have genuinely never seen before in tennis. The hunger in the fan base, the emotional investment, the way communities that have no prior connection to the sport are suddenly organizing around it. The way her name is becoming shorthand for something that goes far beyond athletic achievement. The President of the Philippines cited her in his State of the Nation address. He gave her a presidential citation and used her name and her story as a rallying point for broader Philippine sporting ambition. When a head of state uses an athlete's journey in a speech about national possibility, not because they have won an Olympic gold, not because they have broken a world record, but because of what their rise means culturally, that athlete has crossed a threshold that most athletes never reach. Alex Eala has crossed that threshold. She is no longer just the best tennis player the Philippines has ever produced. She is a national conversation. She is a symbol that the country is using to think about itself, to think about what its people are capable of, to think about which doors are open that previous generations assumed were closed. And she is 21 years old. That is the detail that makes everything about this story feel almost too extraordinary to be real. She has not even reached the prime years of a professional tennis career. The typical women's tennis player hits their absolute peak in their mid to late 20s. Eala is just beginning. The results she has produced this year, the Wimbledon 4th round, the Washington title, the top 20 ranking, the trajectory that has the tennis world genuinely debating whether a first Grand Slam final appearance is on the horizon, all of that has happened before she has fully arrived as a tennis player. What comes after is genuinely unknowable. Maybe she wins a Grand Slam. Maybe she does not. Maybe she finishes her career as a perennial top 10 player who wins multiple titles but never breaks through at the slams in the way the ultimate champions do. Maybe the story takes a turn that nobody expects. An injury, a slump, the 1,000 unpredictable variables that make professional sport impossible to script. None of that changes what is already true. None of that undoes what she has already built. Because the Filipino children who picked up tennis rackets this year because of her, they did it. That already happened. The watch parties that filled barangay halls and mall food courts and living rooms across the archipelago, those happened. The conversations in family group chats, the late nights, The collective held breath and collective exhale, those are memories now. They exist. They shaped people. They changed what people believe is possible. A trophy can be won, and then the moment passes. A ranking can rise and then fall and rise again. But the shift in what a generation believes about themselves and their place in the world, that does not pass. That becomes part of how they see themselves forever. That is what Alex Eala is doing. Not just winning tennis matches. Not just climbing a ranking. She is rewriting the script that millions of Filipinos carry inside them about which stages they are allowed to stand on and which spaces are available to them. And the final question, the one that carries the most weight, is this. What happens when the child who watched her win in Washington grows up and walks onto a professional tennis court with a racket in their hand and a dream that feels real because Alex Eala made it real? What does that next generation produce? What does the Philippine tennis landscape look like in 10 years, in 20 years, if what she has started continues to grow? Nobody knows, but the answer is being written right now, on courts in Manila and Cebu and Davao. In the junior academies that are starting to fill up with children whose parents once never considered tennis as an option. In the imagination of every young Filipino who watched a girl from Quezon City stare down the greatest players in the world and refuse to blink. The greatest legacy Alex Eala will ever leave is not hanging in a trophy cabinet. It is running around on a tennis court somewhere in the Philippines right now, swinging a racket, believing something that could not have been believed before. That is more than a tennis player. That is a door being held open for everyone who comes after.